So hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are on the map. Welcome to the second session of the series of conversations in AI geopolitics in the military domain. My name is Brisa and I'll be your moderator today. I'm very happy to be talking in this session with Nicole van Rooijen and Peter Asaro about ethical dilemmas and global governance challenges in the military use of AI. So thank you very much for joining us. And first of all, I also want to do a little introduction regarding the Sehlac Youth Group, which is the organizer of this series of talks. The Sehlac Group is a network of young professionals from Latin America working in disarmament and arms control. We started the group
Community
last
is
year.
an important capacity building and education opportunity for DevSec members.
Good. We started the group last year in an effort to build synergies among young people who were working in these issues. So if you're interested in knowing more about us, I would recommend you to find more information in the Sehlac website or just contact us directly. Back to today's guest speakers, I'm happy to introduce Peter Asaro, Chair of Stop Killer Robots and Professor at the New School, who will walk us through ethical dilemmas and recent cases of use of AI in the military domain, and Nicole van Rooijen, Executive Director of Stop Killer Robots, who will cover the current state of international discussions, the campaign itself, and the main challenges and opportunities ahead. In the end, we will have time for questions, so write them down on the chat or raise your virtual hand towards the end. So having said that, I will now give the floor to Nicole.
Thanks a lot, Brisa. And let me just try to put up, share a presentation. Let me see if I can do that. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for inviting us. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Stop Killer Robots and then talk a little bit more about where we stand in the political process in terms of regulating autonomous weapon systems, and a little bit also about more broadly AI in the military domain. But just to start, about Stop Killer Robots. Stop Killer Robots is a global coalition of over 270 NGOs working in more or less 70 countries around the world. And we really call for new international treaty to prohibit and regulate autonomous weapon systems. And while for years that was our sole purpose, we've recently widened the scope of our mission to also include other AI technologies and ensure, but what we want is really to ensure meaningful human control over the use of force, reduce automated harm, and counter digital dehumanization in autonomous weapon systems, but also in other emerging technologies such as decision support systems, for example. And yeah, so what we call for specifically for autonomous weapon systems is a prohibition on autonomous weapon systems that do not allow for meaningful human control, prohibit autonomous weapon systems that can target people, and then regulate all other weapon systems. And I think Peter will talk more in depth about also what autonomous systems are. But for us, autonomous weapon systems are also known as killer robots, hence the name of our campaign. And they are systems that once activated by a human operator can select and apply force without any human intervention. And so that means that once the human operator has launched the weapon systems, it's the system that decides who it will attack or what it will attack, and the human operator no longer knows when the attack will take place or where it will take place. And that, of course, raises a series of ethical concerns, legal concerns, humanitarian and security concerns as well. And we can talk more about that later. So in terms of the political process, I just want to also clarify that there are two separate processes in place at the moment. One is really very much focused on autonomous weapon systems specifically, and the other one, which is more nascent, is about AI in the military domain, and that covers everything, all the uses of AI in the military domain, from logistics to procurement to HR related, but also AI in the kill chain, and we are obviously more interested in the latter. So in terms of the political process, discussions on autonomous weapon systems have been ongoing in Geneva for over a decade within the Convention on Conventional Weapons. And so I think 3 years ago, there was a new mandate adopted, and it was so that process was led. That led to that mandate ensured or sort of made sure that states had to find all the elements that could constitute a possible new treaty. And so that was presided by a Dutch chair, and he came up with this idea of having everyone work on a rolling text, which would, put forward all the elements of a possible treaty, including a definition and other, IHL-related safeguards. And then, there's a growing convergence from states on this rolling text. And in September last year, at the Convention on Conventional Weapons and the group of governmental experts on laws, Brazil delivered a statement on behalf of 42 states saying that they're ready to start negotiation, that this text that they had been working on for almost 3 years was mature enough, and that they're now ready to move to negotiation. And in March this year, Sierra Leone delivered a similar statement on behalf of 20 African states. So really the majority in the room are quite favorable of moving towards negotiations. And this year is a particularly important year for us and for states, because it's the review conference of the convention of the CCW. And that means that the states can really say that they've concluded their mandate and that they can now move to negotiations. And what we would want is to have a short negotiation mandate, maybe 1 or 2 years, and that they then actually adopt the treaty. The difficulty with the Convention on Conventional Weapons is that it's a consensus-based forum, and so if any state decides to put a veto, that kind of defeats the whole momentum of moving towards negotiations. And then a parallel track to that is within the UN General Assembly, where in May last year there was the first informal consultations on autonomous weapons specifically, and then several states, heads of states, and also the UN Secretary General made high-level comments during the high-level week. In September as well, and reiterating a call for a ban on autonomous weapon systems. And then on AI in the military domain, in June this year, the first informal consultations will be held in Geneva. And of concern, as I mentioned, for us and for the coalition, is really these decision support systems, or AI-enabled targeting systems, which are already used and creating devastating humanitarian consequences in Gaza, in Lebanon, and Iran, and in Ukraine. And we really see that the technology is developing faster than the regulatory frameworks, and that civilians pay a very high price. So I'll stop here, and just also, in terms of what people can do is really engage with the campaign, join the campaign, engage with parliamentarians, and there's a link there as well. And we're also engaging more with the financial sector to raise concerns about the lack of regulatory framework on these weapon systems, and just encourage everyone to continue the conversation on AI in the kill chain. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. It's really interesting to see the scope of the campaign and what's been going on in these past years. So thank you very much. And now I'll give the floor to Peter then.
Thank you, Visa, and thank you, Nicole, and thanks for having us here. This is great. I just want to give a little kind of background on the history of that whole kind of or context around the CCW process. I think it's often confusing to people who aren't in the UN on a daily basis, thinking about all these acronyms and all these processes to get a sense of how these political processes work and how that fits into, I think, what are the very real concerns that civil society has around human rights and the effects on civilians of these kinds of autonomous weapon systems and AI in the military more generally, which has become an incredibly pressing issue over the last few months. Um, we started this campaign back in 2012, and there was at that time a report from the Special Rapporteur to the Human Rights Council, the Special Rapporteur for Arbitrary, Summary, and Extrajudicial Execution on autonomous weapon systems, because we saw it very much as a human rights issue. But the Human Rights Council doesn't really like to do arms control. So they sort of, kicked it down the hallway to this other treaty body, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which has as its purview just to sort of look at conventional weapons and really just to look at weapons that are used by militaries in international conflicts. It was a treaty from the early 1980s, kind of height of the Cold War, to try to get the superpowers to negotiate, like, we're not going to use this and we're not going to use that, because it's just too inhumane. um, and there were previous processes there for landmines and cluster munitions, but because of that consensus rule that Nicole mentioned, where every country who's a party has a veto power, they can water it down a lot. It's really hard to get consensus with 127 states, I think it is now, or 130 states. Um, and that also kind of has limited us over time, even though we've talked about it as civil society and we've brought it up over and over in the UN forums, that we're concerned about police use of these systems. We're concerned not just about, these systems that are autonomously, self-contained platform and weapon system and decision system with sensors, which is the kind of robot imaginary that we all have of, Terminator or something like that. But these are all, we already knew, back then, that these are integrated systems. They're satellite systems that are talking to computer databases, that are talking to, planes and robots and drones and all sorts of platforms that are flying and driving and on the oceans and underwater all over the planet. And these are all coordinated in these kind of large scale systems. Um, and how do we really regulate that? And how do we ensure meaningful human control over what are ultimately targeting decisions and use of force decisions about, what's going to get attacked and who might be affected especially in terms of civilians and civilian infrastructure. And the big concern, of course, is that there's no control, right? Like, nobody's responsible, nobody's accountable, nobody quite knows why a decision happened the way it happened. And all of our sort of legal mechanisms for holding people accountable for war crimes don't apply in the same way. And that becomes this kind of escape from responsibility for people that want to use these systems to do harm to civilians. And that was a big concern in the Human Rights Council back then too, because that's what drones and targeted killing with drones was being used as this sort of extrajudicial execution system, where it's not really clear who's responsible or who's accountable and how we would, hold them legally responsible for these things. Um, Now what we've seen, of course, is not just the ongoing development of drones that are more and more autonomous, especially a lot of development happening over the last year or two in Ukraine and Russia and the conflict there, where the drones are becoming increasingly autonomous because both countries have jamming systems. So you can't operate remote control drones in the same way because the control signals get jammed. And so as you get closer to targets, they will take a photo with their sensors, which, it's generally a camera, but it could also be a radar or something. And then they will home in on that sort of designated object in the image, and then sort of dive bomb it. And this is called a pixel lock or a sort of last mile kind of autonomy. But it's still, in some sense, a human who's choosing the object in the sort of field of pixels. But we're seeing more and more, use of AI and image pattern recognition to determine, okay, this is a valid target, and it's just going to attack it without asking for human authorization at that point. And that's really the kind of thing we're most concerned about. Um, but we're also seeing, especially in reports that we got from the Israel war in Gaza, with systems like Lavender, Gospel, Where's Daddy, which are sort of large computer AI database driven systems that cull lots of information from lots of different sources and then identify, individuals as targets or identify the locations of individuals who have appeared on targeting lists, which are not really reviewed or vetted with any depth by humans. There were some reports of, getting these targeting lists of suspected Hamas members and just determining whether they were men or women. And if they were women, they would knock them off the list because Hamas doesn't have female soldiers. But the kinds of data and information that are feeding in, it's like phone calls, surveillance camera data, other kinds of, database tracking, your credit card transactions, things, whatever the kind of data they can get their hands on, going into determining your association with a military organization, which is, historically unprecedented. And, how do you evaluate whether those systems are accurate? And then using those systems to target people in civilian areas where there's going to be collateral damage. I think it's fundamentally immoral to delegate that responsibility of a proportionality decision to a machine that can't really estimate the impact on civilians of even a single kind of civilian death, even if it's somewhat accurate or highly accurate at identifying, combatants or targets, which in this case is still, I think, quite dubious. And what we saw, of course, is the effect of that was massive civilian casualties, far exceeding the number of, supposed targets, and resulting in almost the, complete devastation of civilian areas. And we've seen the same kind of technology now being used by the United States in Iran and their targeting of military sites, but more than any humans could generate, right? So they generate tens of thousands of targets and then actually strike those targets in a very short amount of time. So again, because a lot of it's secret, we can't really evaluate how well any of that was done. We do know that there was the school in Iran that was targeted improperly because it was a school. It had formerly been part of a military base, but more than a decade ago, had been walled out of that base and turned into a school. And there was also a civilian medical facility in that same complex of buildings. And they killed hundreds of children essentially at school that day. And it was effectively a database error and an AI error, but no human checked any of these things. And that's the one we know the most about. But that, they generated over 10,000 targets that first weekend with AI and did very kind of limited evaluation on what those targets actually were. So we don't know how many other ones on that list or similar or were civilians, or what the consequences were for civilians, because there's not a lot of journalistic reporting coming out on that conflict. But we see the trend that militaries are adopting these kinds of systems, both drones becoming widespread, and because of the conflict in Ukraine and the invasion of Russia, like all the states around the world, especially small states who are fearful of their neighbors, are trying to acquire armed drones as quickly as possible because they are a kind of equalizing force against aggressors, but they're also right, dangerous for all kinds of other reasons. And then also this push to more and more autonomy in those drones, leading to the kind of autonomous weapons and the need for regulation that we saw, more than a decade ago and are still pushing for. And then this kind of evolution of decision support systems and the use of things like chatbots and Claude in terms of what used to be just a military intelligence analysis trying to identify where the military bases and what should be bombing targets, utilizing all these AI tools to generate these massive targeting lists and not really vetting those potentially as much as needed. And so um, being able to then escalate the sort of size and scope of warfare at an incredible rate. So this is automation. What automation does is it increases efficiency, it increases scale, and reduces cost. So it costs them much less time and money to generate these huge targeting lists and to attack large numbers of targets. Um, and that means the intensity and devastation of war is faster and greater than it was before. You're just speeding up everything and magnifying everything, amplifying the effects of warfare. And if you try to look towards, war also has resolution. So at what point do you negotiate a treaty or a settlement and find a peaceful resolution of a conflict? That becomes harder. Of course, the more devastation has taken place. And that happens so quickly, right? You sort of start eliminating all of these exit ramps and things like that. So these systems, and we've talked about this again for years in the context of these UN debates, these systems, make it easier for, unpopular dictators or even popular ones to start wars. It becomes sort of politically easier because you say, well, we have this magnificent military force and we're protecting all of our soldiers from attack using drones and using these autonomous weapons, and we have AI generating all these targets, and we're just going to like devastate our enemies. And so that inclines states to go to war. It also creates these arm race scenarios where competitor states are investing massively in developing these arms, which is itself kind of geopolitically destabilizing because you see your neighbor ramping up arms production, then you feel the need to also ramp up arms production to counter that. And so there's a host of reasons to try to regulate these. The challenge, of course, is how do you do that? And the UN has mechanisms for discussion, and I think that's its most valuable thing. It also has mechanisms for creating treaties, but it's also, bound by a lot of norms and structural institutional constraints about how that happens. So we're sort of been stuck for a decade or more in this convention on conventional weapons, which doesn't apply to non-conventional weapons. So, the autonomous control of nuclear weapons, that should be banned too. Like nuclear weapons are already banned. But if you're using them illegally, then you also shouldn't be, controlling them with AI and automated systems. That should be a very human choice. Um, but that's outside of the bounds of this treaty. Like police forces shouldn't be using these systems, but we recognize that these drone systems are already proliferating to police forces. They're being, these systems could be used by states against their own people rather than an international conflict. That should be just as regulated as, the military applications of these in interstate conflict, but that sort of just falls outside of the treaty. And because of the sort of the language and definition that is evolved in the context of these debates, that it's, a single weapon system platform that has sensors that makes decisions and that engages weapons, that sort of precludes, this treaty applying to decision support systems where a human gets the targeting list and then, clicks a button or checks a box and says, yeah, this is an okay targeting list. Technically, that's not an autonomous weapon system, even though the decision process, the software, the algorithms could be identical. and the level of human control could be just as, insignificant in a sense. And so, we're still very committed to the treaty, and we think it will provide a real legal framework and a norm around meaningful human control that we can also hopefully extend to these other domains in the future. It's very challenging. It takes a long time to get a treaty. I don't know if we get another treaty, but I think it will function in people's minds, at least, that this is the case. And, we're sort of far ahead because we've been working on it for so long. We're very close to being able to negotiate a treaty. So I'm very hopeful that we will get a treaty and that the treaty will have an impact on these other discussions and give some momentum to trying to rein in this wider use of military AI that we're seeing already, and which is growing very, very quickly. So
Thank you very much, Peter. You really gave a very wide explanation. I think it was very informative. Also, so a really big umbrella of topics that are relevant to this particular issue. You talked about regulation, digital dehumanization, the geopolitics, and the momentum that has been the coalition has been building in this past years. So thank you very much. And now we can start with the Q&A session. But since I'm a moderator and I have a privileged position in the meeting, I have a question for each of you that just came to mind while you were presenting. First, Peter, because I know your background, you have a degree in computer science, and you are as well a philosopher specialized in technology. What's your take on the idea that technology is neutral? That's something that I've been hearing a lot recently, and I would love to know what you think about it. And I also wonder, where's your opinion about the idea that today humanities have sort of a renewed value as AI seems to start taking more and more spheres and space in our lives. That's for you, Peter. And then for Nicole, you mentioned that the campaign has been engaging with the financial sector. And, since innovation comes mostly from the private sector, and we now see, as Peter mentioned, a large advancement and integration of AI models into military systems, I'm wondering, what's the campaign's strategy for engaging with companies? Because from my perspective, I think this could be quite challenging, but I would like to know what's your experience with that.
do you want to go first, Nicole?
I can. So just to clarify, we started engaging the financial sector more because we launched this statement together with Etica Fund, which is an Italian ethical fund. But the idea was more that it would be an advocacy tool for the financial sector to support our call for a legally binding instrument to say, this, like, you can't invest in these technologies because they fall outside of any regulatory framework. So for now, I think we have about 40 or 45 large investment firms who have actually signed on to our statement, and what we want is for more of them to sign on from across the world. So, if you want to push for that as well, that would be great. But we're trying to get the numbers up and to maybe have about 100 signatories. That would be really great. And what we're also trying to do with the financial sector is also the problem is because there is no regulation, there is no commonly international agreed upon definition. And so for investors as well, it's difficult for them to understand what an autonomous system is, where it starts, where it ends, and how it affects their portfolio directly, because it could also be different. They could be contributing to it, but not directly. And there's also a lot of dual use technologies involved in that, but I'm sure Peter can clarify this. But so for investors, and we do get quite a lot of questions now also from investors or from, for example, large pension funds, Nordic pension funds, who are concerned about how it is affecting their portfolio and don't want to be accused of contributing to any, IHL violations or other atrocities in the world. So just to say, still a very we're still at the initial stages of our engagement with the purely financial sector, but there is a growing concern also about these weapon systems from a financial sector point of view, and that's something we want to engage with, because it is a good pressure point also on these companies, but also on the regulatory framework. Then I'll stop here.
Yeah, thanks. So I will take the bait and the invitation to wax philosophical for a moment. Yeah, so I'm a firm believer, and a lot of my work, even before I started working on this, was focused on the relationship between society and technology, and how do we design technologies that actually benefit society and not vice versa. And in that realm of science and technology studies, there's a famous scholar, Langdon Winner, who actually wrote a book on autonomous systems in 1979. And in that book, he says technology is neither good nor bad nor neutral. And that is just to say that there's always a sort of political and ethical implication to using technologies. They enhance and bolster and amplify a certain set of values, and they also diminish other kinds of values. So all systems have this sort of value-laden process inherent in them, and it's for us to decide what the values are and which systems we want to actually build, how we want to build them to sort of optimize the values that we care about, and diminish the ones that we don't, right? The negative things. And I'm a firm believer in technology, and I studied AI, and I built neural networks, and I worked in computer vision for robotics companies. And then I started to see, like, where is all this technology going? Where is all the funding coming from? And of course, they're going to build these weapon systems, and what can we do about that? And sort of wound up on the track that led me here. But I think ultimately, like, technology is not inevitable. Like, it's always an open-ended process of us reshaping it with our values. And there's certain things technology can't do, and that's a kind of a resistance to our desires and will. So there's an interplay between these things, but ultimately we're the ones who shape it. And I think your point about humanism is critical here, of understanding what is the place of the human, how do we want to protect, and what do we want to protect about being human against transformations in technology. But I think that's also questions about social values. What do we value as a society? What technologies should be maximizing in that, right? And AI right now, it's being driven by people who want to amass and concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a very small number of people, and then use these technologies to kind of preserve that inequality, perpetually. So we have a very, I think, strong call to some kind of democratic response that says humans are important, human rights are important, democracy is important, democratic rights are important, and all of those have to be preserved and valued in the systems that we're adopting. And these military AI systems are not doing that, and we need to build in regulations and mechanisms to do that, if their systems are going to be permitted at all. And if we don't, right, and this is where the surveillance comes in, and my most recent work is looking at, disinformation, persuasion, and influence, from manipulation from AI systems, because I think there's, outside of physical force, these things are psychologically controlling us more and more as we become, more and more avid users of these systems.
Well, thank you very much for your answers. We have now a question in the chat, and then I'll leave the floor for Evelyn so she can ask her question. In the chat, it says, my question, I'm Sol from Argentina. Thanks for your presentation. My question is, If AI technologies are fundamentally dual use, where do you think regulation should realistically focus? On the algorithms themselves, the datasets, sorry, the hardware, or the way the systems are ultimately deployed?
Sorry, do I ask right now or we are
No,
going to
afterward.
ask in?
That's all right.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Thanks.
Just a quick answer response. I think it has to be at the level of application. I mean, AI in general is a bunch of mathematical models that are, and built on huge data sets that nobody understands. The idea that we're going to regulate a specific algorithm or a certain data set, I mean, I think when we understand, like in the case of maybe a mythos from Anthropic that has, potential cybersecurity risks, like we should constrain the distribution of those systems, prevent companies from building those things in the first place, probably. But in general, how do you regulate AI in automobiles versus airplanes versus weapons versus medical diagnosis versus deciding who gets into college or who gets loans? Like all of these are very specialized domains, and they require expertise and data and policy making experience in those domains, and they should be regulated in that way. And it's very hard, I think, to try to regulate AI in general because it has sort of any use at all. Whatever you can find a way to use it for almost anything. And it's hard to predict, is that going to be good or bad, right? You have to understand the problem that it's trying to solve.
Thank you, Peter. So, Evelyn.
Thank you, and sorry for before. So, hello. Thank you for this insightful presentation, Peter and Nicole. My name is Evelyn Gizi. I am speaking on behalf of Disarm, Brazilian Action for Humanitarian Disarmament. And my question is, how can we ensure as civil society that the treaty text is broad enough to be approved and adopted by states, while also addressing concerns related to dehumanization, ethical considerations, international law, as raised by Stop Killer Robots campaign, and everyone that is here probably think about it. So how can we ensure that, that this treaty, because we know that it's discussing and it's negotiation, it's in a closed doors, but how is our paper in here? How can we help on that? Thank you.
Peter, do you want to go first? Or do you want me
Sure,
to?
I can jump in and then you can correct me as I so yeah, great question. I think it's always a challenge, especially in humanitarian disarmament, to work through these political processes, knowing that ultimately there are going to be compromises, and having to make those difficult choices of, you know, is it better to have a treaty even though the treaty is weaker, or is it better to fight for something stronger and wind up possibly with nothing, right? You have to make those kinds of decisions. But I think the way I approach this is that there are two or three really key principles that have to be in whatever treaty we wind up with. And if those get cut, like that's too much, right? And I think it's about the protection of civilians. It's about having a requirement for human control that is effective enough and open enough to sort of cover future technology, but still provide a kind of leverage point for civil society to hold states accountable for the kinds of systems that they build in the future. And then ultimately, I think, this question of the protection of civilians comes to saying that algorithms don't get to decide, what is an acceptable civilian casualty or not. Humans have to make those decisions. They're tough decisions, they're moral decisions, they're legal decisions, and you can't delegate those decisions to machines. Nicole?
Yeah, maybe just to add also that from civil society perspective, it is also about engaging at all levels in terms of at the national level, at the regional level, and like more, we also engage more at the multilateral levels, but really to engage with politicians and everyone that can put pressure on them to say that perhaps IHL is not enough, that we need a treaty that is much more robust, and that can also withstand the test of time of how this technology will evolve as well. So yeah, just to add that I think everyone needs to engage more at different levels as well.
Thank you very much. We have another question on the chat. It says, thank you for your presentation. I'm Manon from the UK, and my question is, do you think state-created control AI will become an issue, or will it remain more of a corporate invention? And how will this state corporate control impact the approach to regulation?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. And I just wrote a piece on this for the Stanford AI 100 report. So the sort of the geopolitics of it. So what we have currently is a situation where most of the leading AI companies are based in the United States and Silicon Valley, but there's a lot of competing companies emerging in China and Europe. And if you take a broad view of AI, not just these big, chatbot models that most people sort of think about AI now, post ChatGPT. Like AI is all over, right? It's been developing for decades in different places. So everybody has a certain element of it, but to do this big model, deep neural network, chat GPT type large language models takes a ton of data, these huge data centers. It's very expensive and resource demanding. So it's limited, and it's limited by how many chips you can get and all of these other factors. So I think what we're seeing is in the US, politically, those companies that control that technology and also vast wealth and power because of their other businesses like social media platforms and the infrastructures and things have, taken over through lobbying the kind of political structure in the US to prevent any kind of regulation of what they're doing in the name of, winning some arms race against competitor states like China or Russia. Um, and then you have China, where you also have a number of private companies that are developing this technology, but are under much tighter control from the government. So I think there we'll continue to see government control and regulation over the technology much more than you're going to see in the US. And then in EU, you have another model where you have private companies developing, but they also have a fairly strong legal regime through the EU and the EU AI Act and the General Data Protection requirements, and probably similar things, although the US is putting tons of pressure on them to roll back the EU AI Act in order to make, it easier, I guess, to develop the technology. I'm not a believer that deregulation actually it spurs innovation. Deregulation spurs, laziness, and what we wind up in design, and you can see this across technologies. The kind of technologies that are designed, they get lazy. They do what's easiest and cheapest and simplest. And if you put in regulation, you get up with better technology. You simplify the options for competitors so that they focus on the things they need to focus on, and you actually wind up with better technologies faster through regulation. And many companies understand that, and many companies are even calling for regulation. But I think it's this sort of mentality of the AI arms race that pushes people to think we have to have, take the gloves off, no regulation, unconstrained, uncontrolled growth of this technology. But it's especially important, I think, in the dual use because a lot of these technologies are being applied to civilian applications. They're affecting everybody's jobs, their education, like all of these other things. And there's a huge need for regulation in all of these domains, not just the military, but I think that's the big challenge. And I think corporations are going to continue to be powerful. I don't think states alone can really drive this kind of technology. I mean, we saw it with space. right? They drove space technology, but was a very different kind of technology. And even that now is being privatized. So I think it's a challenge.
Thank you very much, Peter. There's another question on the chat. So let's see. Thank you. I also have a question. AI will enable a flood of new products and applications, all of which will need oversight. Properly reviewing and regulating them at that scale seems beyond human capacity. So do you think we'll end up using AI to regulate AI?
I sure hope not. I mean, in a sense, yes, right. I mean, it's what's kind. I mean, just to take a step back, like the craziness of trying to understand how these systems work, right? So there was a lot of discussion, and I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago about explainable AI, like being able to actually understand how AI comes to the conclusions that it comes to, and trying to build AI systems that would explain other AI systems. And then they sort of ran out of data to train the system, so they started using AI to generate synthetic data to like feed back into these systems. And all of these techniques, they sort of give you a certain level of improvement to a point, but they're undirected. And so ultimately, they're not going to ever give you what you want, right? They're just going to homogenize the system, maybe offer some advantages initially, but in the long run, they're not a real solution to the problem. And I think ultimately we have to decide, what do we want the technology to do? And how are we going to build a framework to ensure that it does what we want it to do? And we might use AI in doing that. And that's, I think, the way to think about AI. It's a tool. It's a tool that's only as good as the intentions behind its use, and holding it to the standards. You can ask it questions. Sometimes it may give you useful answers, but you need a mechanism for evaluating the quality of its answers. Otherwise, you're just blindly trusting it, right? And it's the same, I think, in every domain. And if you're trying to regulate it, is it doing what it's supposed to do? Well, you can't trust it to regulate itself, just like you can't trust a company to regulate itself. Like, there needs to be these external mechanisms.
Well, thank you very much. If anyone else has a question, please, this is your moment to ask it. I do have a question myself, but I think we're gonna move forward to what Gabrielle is asking on the chat. It says, "Hi, I'm Gabrielle from Brazil. Thank you very much for your presentations. Assuming we are moving towards a concrete multilateral outcome in the near future, what should the campaign and civil society be pushing for the day after a treaty is adopted? What would come next?"
Ratification, right? I mean, we have to get everybody to sign the treaty. Every state has to sign it. That has to go through their parliaments. That'll keep us busy. Hopefully not for years, but a few years maybe. But to get enough states to adopt it for it to go into force is the sort of the first metric. And I think that's generally specified within the treaty, like how many states are needed. And then it becomes the process of, implementing it, like making sure that states follow it and obey it. And that's, I think, going to be a bigger challenge, because we've already experienced this in the campaign where, there's reports that come out of Ukraine or Gaza or elsewhere that some autonomous system is being used. And if we don't have an image of it in action, or, we don't know who built it or who was using it or what the context was, it's very difficult to say, was that an autonomous weapon? Was it autonomously attacking? Was it just being remotely controlled? It's really a challenge. And if states are doing that at scale, then there has to be that civil society pressure to hold them accountable, to get states in these forums to hold them accountable for violating a treaty once it's in place, and pressuring states to join the treaty as well.
Yeah, maybe just to add also that it's also important that these treaties are then translated into national legislation, and that there's a need an effective monitoring mechanisms, just to make sure that, yeah, that states abide by these new treaties as well. So there's still a long way to go for civil society.
There's still a long way to go, as you said. Well, thank you very much, Peter and Nicole, and also to all our attendees. And this was a very interesting and informative session. And I really, really want to thank you both for your time and for taking part in this activity. So from our side, this will be the end of the session. So thank you very much to all of you for joining today.
Well, thank you for having us. It was wonderful.
Thanks a
Thank you.
lot. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye.